Okay. Bienvenue, bonjour tout le monde. Thank you everyone for coming to the 51st event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series. This is the second event of season 4 and our second event of 2022. Thank you to the 460 people who registered for today's event. Before we get started, I just want to apologize that our captioner is not here. We really emphasize the importance of having human captioners, but unfortunately our captioner didn't show up. So if they do show up partway through the meeting, we will switch over to the human captioner. I really want to apologize again. For us, accessibility is very, very important, and we apologize. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of feminist and social justice studies at McGill University and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Technology Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. We are hosting 4 virtual events this winter. Next week, Mindy Sue is speaking, and the following week, Dr. Alex Hanna will present. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, the Sustainability Projects Fund, Mila, and more. This event is particularly co-sponsored by Dr. Damon Matthews of Concordia University as part of the Leadership in Environmental and Digital Innovation for Sustainability. So Dr. Damon Matthews will say a couple words now, and then I'll continue the introduction.
Thank you, Alex, and yes, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to participate in this exciting seminar series. So our program is a graduate student training program based at Concordia University, but in partnership with the 4 Montreal universities and also the Montreal Office of Future Earth. It's called LEADS, or Leadership in Environmental and Digital Innovation for Sustainability, funded by NSERC and also by Concordia University. And the goal of our program is really to train graduate students and connect different communities of science and the digital world, develop skills and experience in sustainability science and digital innovation towards the goal of accelerating transformations to a more sustainable and equitable global society. So I was really pleased when Alex contacted us about the idea of joining forces on this particular seminar. I think there's a good intersection around ideas of digital innovation and how we can do that well and contribute to a more equitable society rather than a less equitable one. So thank you very much, and I look forward very much to the seminar today.
Thank you, Damon. So for everyone, I want to let you know for this event, recording is enabled so the event can be embedded on our website. Don't worry, only the speakers will be shown in the video, and we're not going to record the Q&A period today. We also have a Q&A option available. So throughout the event, you can type your questions into the Q&A answer box. It's at the bottom of your screen, and there will be some time at the end for Dr. Max Liboiron to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we are very grateful for the discussion that you generate. As we welcome you into our homes and our offices through Zoom, and you welcome us into ours, let us be mindful of the space and place. Past series speakers Suzanne Kite and Jess McLean have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While the events this semester are virtual, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. As our speaker for today, Dr. Max Liboiron writes in their book, Pollution and Colonialism, colonialism first, foremost, and always is about land. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our events are on. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it's important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. As you know, perhaps, the series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. Both McGill and Concordia, one of our co-sponsors, are currently located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities such as the Wet'suwet'en people at the Unistoten camp, water protectors, and people involved in land back movements make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. As Dr. Liboiron writes, to change colonial land relations and enact other types of land relations requires specificity. I encourage you to learn more about the lands that you are on. Nativeland.ca is a fantastic resource for beginning. I'm honored to welcome as our speaker today, Dr. Max Liboiron, as an associate professor in geography and is formerly the associate vice president of Indigenous research at Memorial University. Liboiron is Métis, Michif, Woodman via Red River, who grew up in Lac La Biche, Treaty 6 territory. Dr. Max Liboiron is leader in both developing and promoting anti-colonial research methods into a wide array of disciplines and spaces. As founder of CLEAR, an interdisciplinary plastic pollution laboratory whose methods foreground humility and good land relations, Liboiron has influenced national policy on both plastics and Indigenous research, invented technologies and protocols for community monitoring of plastics, and led the development of the interdisciplinary field of discard studies. If you haven't checked it out yet, Liboiron's book, Pollution is Colonialism, is amazing. You have to read it. It's so good. It bridges science and technology studies, Indigenous studies, and discard studies while providing a framework for understanding all research methods as practices that align with or against colonialism, focusing on plastic pollution, the text models, and anti-colonial scientific practice associated with Métis concepts of land, ethics, and relations, and demonstrates that anti-colonial science is not only possible, but is currently being practiced. I'm so inspired by Dr. Max Liboiron's work and writings, and I'm so happy to be here today. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Max Liboiron. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for that introduction, Tanshi Kipikia. I am nervous about this talk in a way that I am never nervous about talks. On Twitter, where I spend now almost all of my social time, there were some oh my god tweets and some be there, be square tweets. But folks, as you all know, it is impossible to be intelligent and articulate and to think on the spot when you're in survival mode, which a lot of us are right now. I'd say most of us are right now. All my creativity and energy goes to getting groceries with as little risk as possible. And of course, my university announced in-person teaching starting next week, even though we have some of the highest rates of, we do have the highest rates of hospitalization and death in the province since COVID began. So also haven't slept, a little bit stressed out, which means that this talk will be different and not good in the same way as many of my other talks. I think that's fine, but it's what we're in for. So thank you for joining me on that. One of the exciting things about this, though, is that when and I think most people are in survival mode, I don't have new ideas. There's lots of rehashing and getting into trenches with your ideas. And writing this talk got me to stretch out in a few, not new directions, but like eke out of the ruts of the things that I've been speaking and writing about for some time. And so that was exciting. And so my dearest dream is that we think some things together today. And at some point someone says, oh, huh. And that is my hope and dream. So thank you very much. I'm going to start or continue with a land acknowledgement, another land acknowledgement, I should say. I'm speaking to you from St. John's, which is the capital city of the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. They're the homelands of the Beothuk. The wider province are also the homelands of the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit, none of which are my people. I come from much farther away. So I still do land acknowledgements, even though they are heavily and rightfully critiqued. I don't think erasure is better than tokenism, which I hope isn't a radical statement. And also it's a statement that I think fits with the themes that I'll be talking about today, including this idea of compromise, which I'll talk about in a little while. One of the core critiques of land acknowledgements is also very germane to this talk. And the critique is something like land acknowledgements don't scale, they don't change land relations. And in fact, they can even ingrain colonial land relations because as techniques, they get subsumed into a larger infrastructure of settler access to Indigenous land because it looks like something's being done about it. It looks like someone's on the right side, so we're good to go, right? So that sort of problem and the needing to change infrastructure and not just exist in it is something I'll be talking about today. So all of the courses that I teach, mostly undergraduate, although not exclusively, courses on science and technology studies and feminist technologies, are all about switching from thinking about technologies to infrastructure and from science to knowledge systems. And this talk comes out of me being like, oh, I think I'm starting to understand that better now. So this is what we are in for, you and I, in our near future together. I'm going to talk about theories of infrastructure for a little while, and what I mean by using this word all the time. I'm going to talk a bit about compromise. I shouldn't have worn black, horrible weather person decision, which fits inside of theories of change relating to infrastructure. I'm going to use examples from administrative activism to talk about these things. And then if you don't have a university to be a case study, I'm going to talk about partnership and collaboration in research, but I think it works in other like NGO and finance and other places too, and that what's called an ethic of incommensurability. And then I will conclude. Throughout, there are these slightly dark and moody pieces of art. They're all mine. I used to be a professional artist, and I almost never use that art anymore, but I've pulled it out for some reason. So luckily, I've been thinking about a lot of these things perhaps intuitively for a really long time. And so this sort of dark and moody art where these figures are changing and working over and over through many seasons, but never completely transforming, but also never being separate, I think is germane to the talk. So there'll be some art. You can ignore it or not. You can listen to this like radio if you're all zoomed out. So let us start with some ideas of infrastructure. So I often use, when I talk about infrastructure, I often use this quote from Anne Murphy's book, The Economization of Life, which is really good. And it's about colonialism and the concept of population. And it's linked to control of the colonized. And they talk about infrastructure in terms of the way that material supports come to exist, not just in terms of buildings and roads and pipes, but also bureaucracies and forms and the way funding flows and norms and affect. And this is what power relations live in and through, these material supports. So the premise of this talk is infrastructural, meaning that whenever you're trying to change a system, you're working in it, you're working within it, there is no outside of these systems. It has existing norms and ways of seeing what it can and cannot discern, what it can and cannot imagine, what makes easy and what flows and what doesn't flow. And this is infrastructure, right? Another way to talk about it. And it always has material terms, and that's always reproduced in material terms. And that means two things. Number one, even when infrastructures and power relations are dominant, they are uneven and have raggedy parts that never quite work properly. You know this because you've all met infrastructure before, lived in it. So there's actually an acute possibility for change. So this is, in a nutshell, my infrastructural theory of change. Second of all, this idea that infrastructure is one of the ways power works through material forms is that even when you are doing this change, because dominant systems are infrastructural, you will also be reproducing parts of that infrastructure that shore up those same power relations you're trying to change. And this is what I mean by compromise, reproducing parts of the system that you don't think are great and are trying to change. So what's key to this first part, this idea that even when infrastructures are dominant, they're also raggedy, is that it doesn't support a theory of change or, a concept of power where power is a smooth monolith, a slick wall that all you can do is throw your soft body against it. That would be a bad theory of change, right? Instead, I follow folks like Wayne Yang, La Paper Sun in the Third University. This is a quote about universities in his book about decolonizing universities. And I don't mean, here is the university, let us decolonize it. I mean, this janky thing called the university decolonizes, which are two very different things. So he says, instead of even though universities are fundamentally colonial and are very much part of the civilizing mission and the one right way to know and all these sorts of things, because it is an assemblage, because it is infrastructural, it's not monolithic, and it's got a lot of machinery always moving around, and those bits can always be subverted and are always being subverted to other purposes. So we need this because we need a theory of action and a theory of change that accounts for the permeabilities of apparatuses of power, right? And that even the most colonial of institutions can inadvertently, not automatically, but can support decolonizing agendas. And I'll talk about this more in a bit, but when I was an executive administrator for a university, this was the most helpful theory for helping me think about trying to change power relations when you were in positions of power and privilege, extreme positions of power and privilege, which is why I bring it up a lot. So you can make change in places in the infrastructure where it, not just where it fails, although it does that, but also where it has to refresh all the time. If you think of like Judith Butler's performativity of gender, or ways that are infrastructural, the working and the maintenance and the renewing and the churning, those are points for change. This is not the theory of change. It's not a universal, everyone should subscribe to a theory of change, but it is a theory of change. And it's one I've discovered is very helpful. Can you guys hear my dog snoring? He's over here.
No, we can't hear. All good.
Okay.
And can I just note really fast that our human captioner is back, so thank you.
Perfect. Good. It's a very cute snore. Maybe he'll get louder. All right. So I'm going to talk about compromise now. So there is no action without infrastructure. And so because of that, you will reproduce some parts of the system you are trying to change. You must. That's how infrastructure works. There's no outside of the infrastructure. There's no outside of the system. It's collaboration with the ground you stand on. And that comes out of Charles Hale's work and Wayne Yang's work. And what's nice about thinking about compromise in these terms is that it's against purity politics, against the idea of doing action on a clean slate. One of the very ubiquitous and significant issues I have, usually with students, but also with popular and sometimes academic discourses around action and activism, whether it's in science, in academia, or outside, is that there's this idea sometimes that you have to have an intention to action pipeline, or a relationship between intention, action, and the deliverable that is devoid of compromise, devoid of contamination. And that is a very colonial way to think about action, because it depends on this idea of terra nullis. So to imagine a clean slate from which to start your action, whether it's anti-colonial science or something else, is to ascribe to terra nullis, the colonizer's dream. This is Rowan Connell's words. It's a sinister proposition for social science, for activism, for natural science. Every time you talk about building up something from scratch in a blank space, the building blocks of something new, right? You're into terra nullis, you're into erasure automatically. And so the idea of compromise helps us get away from that sort of position. It also helps us understand that you don't get to choose the ground you stand on, especially on stolen land, indigenous territories, if they're not yours. Those are shitty relations that you've inherited. And that's where you start from. You don't get to start from somewhere else. There isn't somewhere else. This is the place. And that's the basis of your collaboration in the world. So it's really important in those terms to understand that when I'm talking about compromise and reproducing parts of the system you're trying to change, that's not a bad thing. That's the condition of doing the thing, right? It's not about being caught with your pants down. It's not failure before you start. It's not selling out. It's, it's the condition for making change. There's the direct quote. So I am going to give some examples of feminist and anti-colonial infrastructural change in an example that I don't usually give, and that's administration. There are my little administrative horses trying to make change out of their little boxes. So usually when I give talks like this, I usually talk about scientific technologies I've invented, scientific protocols I've invented, except that even though I still do those things, that's not really where I live anymore in terms of the way I'm thinking. It's not where I park my ethics or my efforts, sorry. So part of the reason is that when I became an administrator, most of the models and strategies and ethics that I had used as a feminist technician or as an anti-colonial scientist didn't work into the set of problems that I was dealing with as an administrator. Even when those techniques worked the way they were supposed to. So even when sort of equality was like kind of on the table and kind of working, it didn't address the issues. Even when we had rerouted funding to the things that needed to be funding, it wasn't addressing relations and it wasn't changing relations, right? So that's why I've started to think more infrastructurally. So I'm going to talk about my work when I was the Associate Vice President of Research for Memorial University. A few years ago, for a couple of years, I was seconded, sucked up the pipe from being a professor into being an executive administrator, which, if you don't know the parlance of executive administration, it means when people talk about the university, usually in forms of complaint, which is legitimate, they're talking about my job and other people, other executive administrators. So I was the man, capital T, capital M, for a while. And as the Associate Vice President of Research, I was basically second, I was going to say in command, but command is not, second in accountability to the entire research ecosystem of the university. So animal ethics, grant services, research contracts, the policy on research centers, which I rewrote so many times, intellectual property, the technical services and staff that make the machines for research labs work, all that sort of stuff. So you might wonder, okay, why did you choose administration as the chosen example of infrastructure and compromise? And it's because one of the things I found useful in research is finding extreme but quintessential examples. So examples that fit the general gist of things, but are so extreme that you can really see what's going on. And there are three things that makes administration extreme but quintessential examples of infrastructure and compromise and ethics. The first is that when things go wrong, they can go very, very wrong. Or when they go right, they can go very, very right. So the stakes are clear. And the stakes include thousands and thousands of people, right? So you have no right to be wrong. And that's a very real thing. The second thing is that the problems that you encounter in executive administration are mind-fucking. And when you are working in a large hierarchical institution, shit rolls uphill. That's a direct quote from Barack Obama, actually. So there are lots of smart people at a university. By the time a problem gets to executive administration, anyone below in the hierarchy would have solved solvable problems. So you only get unsolvable, intractable problems to which there is no good or bad, right or wrong solution, only slightly better or slightly worse. And it can take weeks to eke something to 51% good and 49% crap, right? So that's where the like, oh, okay, shit, now what comes in from my revised title? Like, oh, that's a problem. Oh, shit, now what, right? These impossible problems. Third, autonomy is scarce and not really desirable or ethical. So very different from being a professor or being a researcher or principal investigator, or even from being a graduate student in my experience or a postdoc, because as executive administrator, you represent others and you work for what is best for them, including when they are raging jerks, including when you disagree with it, and you do work at their behest. So because of those three things, the maturation and the nuancing of my politics was immense. And I don't think, even if I had lived 3 lifetimes as a researcher, I think 2 years in executive administration taught me more and nuanced my politics more. So one of the things you learn, a la boxed horses, is that you do not have unlimited strategies, but The system also offers unanticipated strategies via its structure. So this goes again towards the like, universities are not monoliths, there's lots of janky parts. The university is also not this like smooth body, it's full of janky parts. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So one of the things that we did is put in place North America's first Indigenous data sovereignty contract at the university level. What that means is when you're a researcher and you go to work with an Indigenous group or an industry group or a community group or even another university, there's something in the university's machinery that makes you sign a thing that's called a data transfer agreement. It is a contract that has to do with intellectual property. And this is very, very important in universities. And it very much is happening, regardless of whether you notice it or not, because it's our bread and butter. So usually what happens is if I'm a researcher and I create data, regardless of how I created it, is mine. Indigenous data sovereignty is about how Indigenous groups actually need to own, control, access at all times, and possess data that is about them. And so what we did is we put inside a contract that said, even if you're a researcher, actually who's studying Indigenous groups or studying with Indigenous groups, actually the Indigenous groups own the data. That sounds radical, but it really, really isn't, because that is actually what an industry contract is. Pretty much all universities have some researchers working with industry. At Memorial University, we're one of the universities in Canada that does this the most by percentage, and it's usually with oil. So it was not unprecedented, and precedent is very important in, I think, infrastructural change like this. It's not unprecedented to say, actually, someone else owns your own data. And even if you want to publish, you have to check with them first, and they have to give it the green light. So that was surprisingly easy infrastructural change. So universities usually have 3 contracts, a very industry one, a very like researchers have their own data one, and a service one. Our university now has 4 standard contracts, and the 4th one is the Indigenous data sovereignty contract. Now, there is definitely compromise there. So first of all, it is a contract that is full of legal jargon, which is not super accessible to everyone. But I would say that the real compromise comes in because of conflicting goods. So because we're a university, even our industry contract has a loophole for graduate students, and so does our Indigenous sovereignty contract. This thing happens more often than you think, and I only realized this when I was admin, that advisors often withhold data from their graduate students, like often, and it causes obvious problems for graduation and career progression and this sort of stuff. So universities have things in place to make sure graduate students can always access their data. Whether those get exercised or not is another conversation, but legally, almost every university has this, anyone that I've worked with. And so there's a loophole in the Indigenous data sovereignty contract that you can drive a graduate student through, which is that even if the Indigenous group withholds their information, graduate students can still publish their theses or dissertation. That is good, because graduate students are another group to which universities are beholden, and they are a vulnerable group, but it is not Indigenous data sovereignty. And so this is where compromise comes in, where we have 2 conflicting goods because of the reproduction of different and conflicting parts of a system. I'm going to give you a second example, and then we'll get off administration. Second example is one of the things we did was put in what is called the RIG policy, the Research Impacting Indigenous Groups Policy. So many acronyms, which I found horrible at first and then fun by the middle of my time. So this policy is basically, if you are going to propose, not do, but propose research with Indigenous groups, they have to collectively consent to it before you apply for funding or let the ink dry on your proposal. That means you can't show up with an Indigenous group with funding being like, hey, we're going to study this thing for $1 million. And the Indigenous group is like, well, we don't really care about that, but I guess you have $1 million. So, and that happens more often than you think it does. So you can, at our university, and this is unique, as are the complaints about it, you cannot apply for funding to study an Indigenous group or on behalf of an Indigenous group before you have their collective consent to do so. Now, again, this is precedented in many ways. We have human research ethics which talks about individual consent. So even though collective consent was difficult for folks to wrap their head around, and still often is, at least the concept of consent is and robust consent is common in research. The second thing is that in Canada, if you're in the Canadian research ecosystem, we have TCPS2 Chapter 9, which is basically the chapter in the National Human Ethics Code that is just for Indigenous people. It's in there shoehorned like a weird thing. It does not fit, but there was nowhere else to put it. That's my reading. And so it sort of dangles there, but there's no infrastructure around it. There's no way that it gets enforced. There's no way it gets checked on. There's no way it's part of daily infrastructure, daily university research infrastructure. And so that's what we did with this RIG policy. Now the compromise is, one of the ones that I think is the most significant, is that the form of collective consent is, if you're going to do research on an Indigenous land claim area or covered by an Indigenous treaty or on a reserve, the collective consent has to come from the governing body of that, not individual groups or individuals, collections of individuals within that, but the governing body. And that is sovereignty. That is a sovereign Indigenous sovereignty model, right? Indigenous people governing their own land, right? And it's the university's recognition of that. But the issue is, the compromise is, and that is good. That is unquestionably good. But at the same time, there is always a gap between a governance body, Indigenous or otherwise, and the people that are being governed, right? And that gap can be very, very real and can sometimes be the reason for research. So it isn't, there are many models of Indigenous sovereignty, and national is one of several, and that's the one the policy went with. So again, it's both very, very good and also a potential issue at the same time. So what these examples taught me in terms of compromise is this concept of incommensurability, an ethic of incommensurability, not just incommensurability, which like in science and quant, it means like things that don't share a measure and can't be compared. But Tuck and Yang and decolonization is not a metaphor. And Tuck also talks about this in her Place in Research book with Mackenzie. They talk about an ethic of incommensurability, about recognizing things that are distinct, right? Conflicting goods, and cannot be joined and cannot be conflated and cannot be brought to bear on one another. And it brings them into conversation without smushing them, but also without making false dichotomies, right? The opposite of Indigenous sovereignty is not bodily sovereignty, right? And the opposite of good for graduate students is not bad for Indigenous folks, right? So these aren't actually dichotomies or opposites or hard lines or, you know, these sorts of things. So it's actually very tricky, and hanging out in that ethic can be very tricky. But it is, I think, this is the ethic that you deal with if you're dealing with infrastructural change. So what if you don't have a university? If you're like, okay, fine, but I actually could do infrastructural change because I could influence the policy of an entire university. What if you don't have that? That is fine. So I want to talk about partnership and collaboration across difference. So research partnerships, community partnerships with researchers, NGOs, even industry, I suppose. So one of the ways this really came home for me is that I do mostly partnership research, mostly community-based research. And one of my biggest research projects ongoing, and will be for the rest of my career, is that I work with the Nunatsiavut government on plastic monitoring of Nunatsiavut, in Inamapuvut, which is the ocean part of Nunatsiavut, which is the northern Inuit land claim in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I have an Inuk, which is singular for Inuit, partner, co-researcher, and we are true co-researchers. We co-design things together, all that sort of stuff. However, one of the things that has become very obvious is that my Inuk co-researcher doesn't write academic things or anything, although she does make very good TikToks. But so she does do research dissemination, but not in the written form. So no matter how much we talk or direct message or talk on Facebook Messenger, we will never be on the same page, nor can we. Métis and Inuit are not the same. academics and community-based learners are not the same. But I'm the writer, which means no matter what, for all written materials, it's always going to be my version, and there's not a way around that. So even in the best versions of partnerships, and I think my research with this person in the group is an excellent partnership, it will always be uneven, and always that unevenness power will still accrue to the more powerful conventional group, which is me. And so the question about how to bring folks to the table or on board or that sort of stuff when it's my table and it's my on board has not actually served me and that research well. And it doesn't address this sort of compromise issue where you're reproducing shitty parts of the system in these excellent partnerships. So there is this amazing paper that I have found so very useful for this. So first of all, I want to introduce you to like two dogged virgins approaching this horny as sort of a fetishistic desire to unite. I thought that was very fun. So Jones with Jenkins, and not Jones and Jenkins, but Jones with Jenkins, which is sort of a way for their author order and position to talk about this unevenness, talks about how the dominant colonial research ideal of the mutuality of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers tends to soften the differences between them. They call it the hyphen. In the interest of mutuality, stuff gets collapsed together that should be incommensurability. So in this progress towards the social idea of equality or radical inclusion, the structural power differences, as well as other fundamental differences in perspective, history, knowledge, power, et cetera, get downplayed in the attempt to have a shared perspective. We will not have a shared perspective. That is, yeah. So this injunction to listen to the other can turn out very often, this is another quote from them, quote, to be access for dominant groups to the thoughts, cultures, and lives of others. I write about this in my book, about how a lot of like efforts to do good around Indigenous groups often grant non-Indigenous people access to Indigenous land for non-Indigenous goals, which is the root of colonialism. So again, sort of like land relations being subsumed into the infrastructure of colonial land relations, so too can partnerships that are very much intending to be the opposite of that. This is all about like compromising the ground you stand on, and that it's already pretty rife. So the question is, given that dominant infrastructures will keep this unevenness alive, even if parts of it change, and you will reproduce some of those power dynamics because there is no outside of the system, what are some of the ethics of incommensurability that are available for those sorts of relationships? So I'm going to give you a few models, all of which I've been involved with in one way or another. So a sovereignty model for a research collaboration with Indigenous groups can be that the Indigenous group decides the priorities, the overarching ethics and goals of the research, but then I, as the researcher, fuck off and do the work. And then I bring it back what they asked for and deliver it. And if it's not what they wanted, I do this a couple of times. And that's because the work of talking to me all the time and trying to get me on the same page is exhausting and not very fun for them. Also not necessary if I'm just going to get some research done for them that they need. I do need to turn up regularly in very real ways, but I also need to fuck off in very real ways. And that is, yeah, that's the recognition of unevenness and sort of owning your place in the uneven infrastructural stuff. See, this is where my brain gets a little mushy. Another model that I'm engaged in right now is that I'm an administrator for a group. So I went and got the grants, I parcel out the money, but I don't know what they're doing with the money. I'm at home I'm at work, also at home, doing the chores to make sure that the funds flow. And that means reproducing a lot of the colonial administrative university systems, metrics, that I have huge problems with, but I'm just gathering them and putting them in big piles, and narratives that are sometimes fetishistic, but they flow through funders like greased lightning. And I do that reproduction of the system that I have a problem with. I do that kind of compromise so that the greatest good can happen, which is that settler government money is flowing to water stewardship in this particular case. So that's a very specific form of compromise. And then if the partners really do have to inform the work because there's no way to do good work without that, I turn to infrastructure, right? This idea of getting things right into the wheel so that the way the infrastructure reproduces itself is more aligned with what I want. So that means hiring them, many of them, so that they can outnumber the other types of researchers, so that they can steer the project without having to ask or even have a conversation with me because they're doing the project. They make up the project, and that involves money to pay them. And these are only some of the models. These are not the only models. These are just me coming to understand and maturing into this idea that one of the very often promoted forms of Indigenous partnership, which is this, actually does not serve folks well. And does not have an ethic of incommensurability. But these other modes do, instead of leaving us with paralysis, we're back to Jones with Jenkins, it suggests hard work, not the hard work of chatting it out and getting on the same page, but the work of owning the ground you stand on, including your place on stolen land, including my place as a diasporic Indigenous person. Accepting the differences and taking on very often the politics of disappointment and ambivalence and what I am calling compromise. So yeah, and those are forms of goodness, right? And that again is outside the purity model of that goodness is like a pure white shining light. No, it's a muddy cocktail. My metaphor has died. But so this is my concluding slide. Actually, my bibliography is my concluding slide. So this is how I started. And this is actually how the title of this talk started, because I reached for something handy based on talks I've already given before. But, and I still do open science based on sort of these different techniques of openness and equity and accessibility and environmentally friendly materials. But while these solve some of the technical problems that we have in the lab for doing research on pollution in Indigenous lands, they do not change land relations, and they don't solve any of the more tangly problems. They don't scale up into infrastructure, and they don't always have a very good ethic of commensurability. And so this, there we go. This list is basically from La Paperson's Characteristics of a Decolonizing University. And this is much more sort of where I've ended up, and using this kind of list as an inspiration for thinking about styles of compromise, infrastructural change, and ethic of incommensurability. And that is, this already exists. You do not wait for the decolonial horizon to appear or the feminist horizon to appear to start changing things within those social movements. Its mission is decolonization. It is strategic. It is not theoretical. It is boots on the ground, strategic, making the moves to make the things happen. It is vocational. I'm going to skip some. It's vocational, meaning it's based on skills and getting the stuff done and showing people how to get it done so they too can get it done. It is unromantic, mostly because it is highly problematic. So his model and my model was a university, super screwed up spaces, as most of us are experiencing, but still are able to get the work done because it is less this model of a decolonizing university or whatever you want to use in terms of instead of the university. It's not that Yang doesn't want to like have a university and then decolonize it, like decolonize the noun. He's talking about a very problematic noun called the university that is decolonizing, right? Doing the action. It is fundamentally productive, even though it is also deeply problematic. And so these sort of politics and this sort of nuance has been serving some of these other projects better than, yeah, these other ones. Again, I'm not saying don't do these ones. I still do this stuff. I'm making an open science ice core because we need one. But I'm trying to find ways to put it into this service on this side instead of staying at this level. So that was it. That was the last slide. Here's my bibliography. And thank you for your time.
Thank you